The summer sun had just begun to rise over the mountains when two brothers pulled into the gravel lot at the base of the ridge trail. It was the kind of morning hikers dream of: clear skies, crisp air, and a trail system popular with families and weekend adventurers. The brothers, both in their 20s, were familiar with the area. They had grown up in the region, spent countless hours exploring its ridgelines and streams, and often returned during the summer to escape the noise of town life. That morning seemed no different. Their car was parked neatly at the edge of the lot, locked, with no sign that anything unusual was about to unfold. By evening, that same car would be the center of attention. Its doors were shut, windows rolled up, and inside sat small personal belongings: receipts, a pair of sunglasses, even a folded map of the region's trails. What was missing were the backpacks the brothers had carried with them, the ones friends said they almost never hiked without. By dusk, when they hadn't returned home or checked in with their family, concern began to rise. The brothers weren't careless or prone to reckless adventure. They were grounded, responsible, and close with their parents. A call was made to local authorities reporting them missing, a call that would ignite one of the largest search and rescue operations the county had ever mounted. The first hours after a disappearance are the most critical. Deputies responded quickly, driving out to the trailhead and retracing the steps the brothers were believed to have taken. But with several routes leading up the ridge and numerous branches splitting into side paths, it was impossible to know which way they had gone. The trail stretched for miles, some sections leading to popular overlooks, others disappearing into dense, unforgiving forest. Searchers noted how the trailhead itself gave no obvious clue: no abandoned gear, no sign of distress. It looked like two young men had started a routine hike and simply vanished into the tree line. By midnight, family members had gathered at the ranger station. Their voices carried a mix of disbelief and fear. No one wanted to imagine the brothers spending the night exposed in the mountains. Teams were mobilized, and by dawn the next day, dozens of trained search and rescue personnel, volunteers, and deputies were combing the area. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping through canyons and ridges. Tracking dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, following scents that began near the parked car and carried into the trail system. For a time, there was hope. One dog alerted on a section of dirt where boot prints matched the general description of the brothers' hiking shoes. Yet, as the line of prints led deeper into the woods, they abruptly disappeared on hard stone, leaving trackers with nothing to follow. The terrain itself posed relentless challenges. Jagged rocks, steep ravines, and thick undergrowth turned the search into a grueling effort. Searchers called out the brothers' names again and again, waiting for any kind of reply. Radios crackled with updates: possible prints, bent branches, a broken piece of brush that could mean someone had passed through. But every lead ended the same way, with silence and no trace of the missing men. The longer the hours stretched, the more unsettling the situation became. Even experienced search coordinators admitted it was unusual. Hikers might get lost, yes, but usually there are signs: discarded gear, a trail of footprints, or even shouted calls for help. Here, there was nothing. By the second night, anxiety settled over everyone involved. Family members sat sleepless in motel rooms, clinging to the idea that the brothers had simply taken a wrong turn and would be found exhausted, but alive. Authorities expanded the grid, sending teams farther from the main ridge, into canyons and drainage basins, where injured hikers sometimes collapsed. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras scanned for heat signatures, but none matched the profile of two young men. The woods returned to only cold silence. The parked car at the trailhead became a haunting image for locals. Reporters filmed it, neighbors stopped by to look at it, and the question everyone asked was the same: how could two healthy, experienced hikers walk into the mountains on a clear day and never walk out? Inside the vehicle, nothing seemed disturbed. Their wallets and phones were missing, suggesting they had taken them along, but everything else was orderly. Investigators noted the absence of camping gear or sleeping bags. This wasn't an overnight trip. They had intended only a day hike. That detail unsettled searchers further. If the brothers had planned to be back by evening, what had kept them from returning? As hours turned into days, search teams numbered in the hundreds. Volunteers scoured trails, ravines, and creek beds. Local businesses donated food and water to sustain the operation. The sheriff's department released maps showing search zones shaded in red, each section systematically cleared with no results. Every empty grid only deepened the mystery. By the end of the week, frustration set in. Families begged searchers not to give up, even as fatigue wore down the volunteers. Officials admitted privately that they were baffled. The brothers' disappearance did not fit the usual patterns. No bodies, no belongings, no signs of a struggle. Just a car, 2 missing backpacks, and a trail that seemed to swallow them whole. In quiet moments, some searchers confessed to each other that it felt as if the mountain itself had hidden them. It was an unsettling idea, but it captured the fear growing in the community. Parents warned children to avoid the trails, rumors spread of dangerous wildlife encounters, and speculation took hold in town. Every theory seemed possible, but none could be proven. The disappearance of the brothers on that ridge was no longer just a missing persons case. It was becoming something larger, something that gnawed at everyone involved. The unanswered questions left investigators restless and the family shattered. And as the first week closed with no trace of the men, authorities prepared to expand their search further into the wilderness, not realizing that the case was about to become one of the darkest and most haunting mysteries their county had ever faced. By the second week of the search, the Ridge Trail had transformed from a peaceful summer escape into the heart of a community-wide emergency. Helicopters droned overhead from dawn to dusk, their blades echoing across valleys that had once been filled only with birdsong and rushing streams. Search dogs strained against their leads, noses pressed into the dirt as handlers tried to coax them forward. Lines of volunteers, many of them neighbors and friends of the missing brothers, marched shoulder to shoulder through thickets and ravines, their voices calling out again and again, desperate for an answer. What had begun as a standard missing persons case was spiraling into something far more unsettling. News crews arrived quickly, parking vans near the ranger station and setting up bright lights that pierced the dark mountain nights. Local anchors stood in front of cameras, their voices heavy with unease as they described the details. 2 young men, experienced hikers, gone without a trace. The headlines spread across the state, then the nation, sparking fear among those who knew the trail well. Parents who once encouraged their children to explore the woods now warned them to stay far away. Joggers and dog walkers stopped coming, the trailhead parking lot reduced to silence, save for the authorities who remained. As the search intensified, strange details began to surface. A group of volunteers reported seeing boot prints deep in a muddy section of the trail, prints that appeared to match the brothers' shoe sizes. But the path of those impressions was strange. They doubled back on themselves, as if the men had turned around, hesitated, then gone back the way they came. Not long after, another team discovered a cluster of broken branches and disturbed brush, the kind of markings searchers typically associate with someone forcing their way through dense growth. Yet when trackers followed that line, it ended abruptly in open ground, no clear continuation. Each clue only opened more questions. The sheriff's department, under mounting public pressure, held daily briefings outside the ranger station. Deputies described their expanding search zones, spoke of tireless work, but behind their words was a quiet admission. Nothing made sense. There were no discarded food wrappers, no empty water bottles, no torn clothing, not even a campsite. It was as though the brothers had stepped into the forest and dissolved into the air. Reporters pushed for explanations, suggesting animal attacks, accidental falls, even the possibility that the brothers had staged their disappearance. Each theory unsettled the family further, as the story took on a life of its own. In town, panic spread. Grocery stores buzzed with whispered speculation, coffee shop conversations circled around the case, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Some insisted the brothers had run into trouble with dangerous people. Others swore they had heard distant cries in the woods at night. Every shadow became a potential lead, every rumor a possible truth. The sense of fear was amplified by the sheer scale of the operation. Dozens of uniformed officers, searchers in neon vests, and volunteers carrying radios filled the woods, their presence a constant reminder that something deeply wrong had occurred. The family clung to hope, waiting anxiously by their phones for any scrap of news. They attended the briefings, their faces pale, their words pleading for the search to continue. Community members brought food to the command post, trying to help in the only way they knew how. The search was not just about finding two missing men anymore. It had become a desperate effort to restore a sense of safety and order to a town that suddenly felt exposed to something it could not explain. Every new discovery added fuel to the uncertainty. A sheriff's deputy noted what looked like drag marks in a patch of loose soil, but follow-up teams found no continuation of the trail. Search dogs alerted near a stream, barking and pacing furiously, but divers who combed the water turned up nothing but silt and stones. Helicopters with infrared scanning equipment passed overhead nightly, yet the screens remained empty. No heat signatures, no signs of life. Leads that promised resolution collapsed into silence, one after another. By the end of the second week, search organizers admitted privately that the situation was unlike anything they had handled before. Lost hikers are usually found within days, alive or otherwise. Equipment is discovered, bodies recovered, or at least clear evidence of what happened. Here, there was nothing. The woods seemed unwilling to give up its secret. That silence fed the panic further. Local newspapers ran bold headlines, calling the disappearance the Ridge Mystery. Residents locked their doors earlier at night, avoiding the trail system altogether. And through it all, the brothers' family endured the endless churn of speculation, forced to hear strangers dissect their loved ones' lives as if they were stories instead of sons. The confusion of the search left scars. Volunteers began to question their own observations. Were the boot prints truly fresh, or had they been left by another hiker weeks before? Was the broken brush evidence of the brothers forcing their way through, or simply the result of deer moving through the undergrowth? Each clue, once thought to be a breakthrough, now seemed fragile and unreliable. The longer the case dragged on, the more it slipped into something beyond rational explanation. Yet the search pressed forward, driven less by expectation of success and more by fear of failure. No one wanted to be the one to leave the forest unsearched. No one wanted to be accused of abandoning the brothers too soon. And so, day after day, the grid widened, the helicopters flew, and the dogs continued to circle while the truth of what had happened remained hidden. In the end, the second week of searching brought only exhaustion and despair. The trail system had been covered multiple times, every likely area checked, every clue tested. The operation was beginning to reach its limit, resources stretched thin. Officials prepared the family for what they did not want to hear, that soon the official search would wind down. The thought of ending the hunt without answers left the community uneasy, unwilling to let go. Something had happened on that ridge, something no one could yet explain. And as the official search neared its end, fear gave way to something heavier, the grim realization that the mystery of the brothers' disappearance might endure for far longer than anyone had imagined. As the official search wound down and helicopters left the sky quiet again, investigators were left with nothing concrete, no remains, no belongings, and no explanation. That vacuum of answers was quickly filled with speculation. Every theory, from the simple to the far-fetched, took hold in the minds of both detectives and locals, desperate to make sense of what had happened. The first and most obvious idea was that the brothers had simply gotten lost. Even experienced hikers can make mistakes, and the Ridge Trail was known for its branching paths and unmarked side routes that could confuse anyone. Perhaps they had strayed too far off the main trail, lost their bearings, and walked deeper into the backcountry. It was plausible, but investigators kept coming back to one problem. After weeks of searching with hundreds of boots on the ground, not a single piece of evidence supported that theory. If they had become lost, something should have surfaced. Still, the lost hiker scenario dominated early conversations. Detectives pulled maps of the area, pointing to rugged valleys where a wrong turn could prove fatal. They considered the possibility that the brothers had fallen into a dense underbrush or a steep ravine that had hidden them from searchers. But doubts remained. Both brothers were familiar with the terrain, and neither had carried gear suggesting they planned to wander far from the trail. If they were lost, why hadn't they called for help? Why hadn't they tried to make themselves visible to helicopters sweeping above? Those unanswered questions led investigators to dig deeper. Locals began offering their own explanations, many of which were far darker. Some whispered about sinkholes hidden in the forest, sudden drops of earth that could swallow a person whole. Old-timers brought up abandoned mine shafts, remnants of a forgotten era of prospecting. The land surrounding the ridge was riddled with such shafts, many unmarked and unsecured, gaping pits covered only by loose soil and brush. If the brothers had stumbled across one, they could have fallen in, leaving no sign on the surface. It was a chilling possibility, one that search teams couldn't completely rule out. Crews lowered cameras into known shafts, checked maps for others, but nothing revealed itself. The mine theory lingered in the community, its plausibility terrifying in its silence. Then there was the question of why the brothers had gone out with so little preparation. They had no camping equipment, no cooking supplies, not even jackets for the cold nights. Detectives puzzled over that fact. If the hike was meant to be short, why take backpacks at all? What exactly had been inside them? Friends recalled seeing them pack bottles of water and snacks. But beyond that, no one could say for sure. That absence of detail opened the door to a more unsettling theory. Perhaps they weren't planning a hike in the ordinary sense. Perhaps they were meeting someone. Investigators pulled phone records, financial statements, anything that could hint at secret plans. They found no evidence of criminal ties, no sign of debt, no sudden withdrawals that might suggest they were running away. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the strange feeling that the disappearance looked less like an accident and more like a clean break. Foul play crept into their minds. Had the brothers crossed paths with the wrong person out on the ridge? Was there someone out there with a reason to harm them? The silence of the woods, the lack of belongings, the vanishing footprints, all of it could suggest an encounter that ended violently. Law enforcement interviewed locals who frequented the area. Hunters, hikers, even transient campers were questioned. One man admitted he had seen a pair of hikers matching the brothers' description near a side trail the day they vanished. But when pressed for detail, his memory faltered. Another recalled hearing what sounded like shouting far off in the woods, but he couldn't say where or when. These fragments of testimony only deepened the mystery, painting an incomplete picture that never fit together. Rumors spread quickly in town. Some said the brothers had gotten involved in something dangerous, that the backpacks contained more than just snacks. Others suggested they had been followed, targeted for reasons unknown. Without evidence, every theory was given room to grow. The sheriff's office had to stand before cameras and insist they were considering all possibilities, but behind closed doors, investigators admitted they were chasing shadows. Each lead they ran down evaporated before it could provide an answer. As the weeks turned into months, the uncertainty weighed heavily on the family. The brother's father pushed back against the idea that his sons had gotten lost or walked away willingly. He insisted they knew those trails, that they were level-headed and not reckless. His pleas echoed in news reports, amplifying the public's growing unease. If the father was right, then something far more sinister had happened on that ridge. That possibility planted fear in the hearts of locals who had once trusted the forest as a safe place. Theories multiplied, and with each one, the case slipped further from clarity. Were the brothers victims of an accident hidden by the unforgiving terrain? Or had they encountered someone who never intended to let them leave the woods alive? The trail offered no answers. The car remained parked, the backpacks remained missing, and the silence of the forest seemed to deepen with every passing day. The investigation had shifted from a frantic search for survivors to a grim attempt to piece together a puzzle without edges. And as time went on, one truth became unavoidable. The brothers were gone, but the question of how and why was only growing darker. With the official search scaling back, investigators found themselves staring at an empty case file. No bodies, no belongings, and no direction left them scrambling for theories to explain what could have happened on the ridge. The simplest answer, and the one most people turned to first, was that the brothers had simply gotten lost. Even the most seasoned hikers can misjudge a trail, and the ridge system stretches for miles with hidden switchbacks and poorly marked forks that could confuse anyone. Perhaps the brothers had strayed too far, lost their bearings, and wandered into backcountry so thick and remote that even the massive search effort had missed them. It was a theory that sounded plausible, but detectives kept circling back to a single problem. After weeks of helicopters, dogs, and ground teams, nothing had been found. Not a shoe, not a bottle, not even a shred of fabric. To accept the lost hiker theory meant believing the brothers had managed to disappear more completely than anyone thought possible. Still, investigators gave it weight. They pulled detailed maps of the terrain, marking out valleys and ravines where a wrong step could have ended in disaster. Some believed the brothers could have fallen into thick brush, hidden so well that their bodies went unseen. But others argued that it was unlikely both would vanish the same way. For two people to make the same mistake at the same time and leave behind no sign pushed the limits of reason. As doubts about that explanation spread, darker possibilities began to take hold. Locals who had grown up near the ridge began whispering about the dangers hidden beneath the forest floor. Old miners remembered the countless shafts that dotted the hillsides, relics from a forgotten time when prospectors had cut deep into the earth in search of ore. Many shafts were never sealed, some covered only by rotting boards or loose soil. To stumble across one was to risk plunging into darkness with no way out. It was an unnerving thought that perhaps the brothers had been swallowed whole by the ground itself. Deputies arranged to search the most obvious shafts, lowering cameras and ropes, but each came up empty. The idea of hidden sinkholes and forgotten mine openings lingered, impossible to disprove. But the detail that unsettled detectives most was what the brothers had brought with them, or, more accurately, what they hadn't. They carried no camping gear, no sleeping bags, and no tents. Their car, still locked at the trailhead, had nothing inside to suggest they had intended to stay overnight. If their plan had been a short hike, then the disappearance became harder to explain. Why take full backpacks for a day trip, and what had been inside them? Friends recalled snacks and water bottles, maybe a notebook, but no one was certain. The lack of clarity about those backpacks left investigators with a gnawing suspicion. Perhaps the hike wasn't about recreation at all. This suspicion led detectives to consider the possibility that the brothers had been planning to meet someone. The parking lot was remote but accessible by car, and the trail system offered privacy. Phone records were checked, financial statements reviewed, but no clear lead emerged. There was no sign of criminal involvement, no evidence that the brothers were running from anyone or anything. Yet the thought remained. If they had agreed to meet someone that day, that person might have been the last to see them alive. Foul play became a word spoken more often inside the sheriff's office. Officers debated whether the case had shifted from a missing person search into a criminal investigation. The lack of gear, the missing backpacks, the silence of the trail, all could be explained if the brothers had been confronted, forced, or taken against their will. Deputies canvassed nearby homes and cabins, questioning hunters, hikers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with them. One camper said he thought he had heard raised voices on the ridge that afternoon, but couldn't identify who they belonged to. Another described seeing two men heading toward a side trail, though he couldn't say for sure it was the brothers. Each witness added fragments, but none offered resolution. In town, theories spread faster than facts. At grocery stores, people whispered that the brothers must have known something they weren't supposed to. Others swore they had gotten caught up with the wrong crowd. A few clung to the idea of a wild animal attack, though the lack of evidence made that theory collapse quickly. Each possibility seemed both plausible and impossible, a contradiction that frustrated both locals and law enforcement. The brothers' family listened to these theories with growing despair. The suggestion that they had staged their disappearance cut the deepest. Detectives found no proof to support that idea, but the rumor persisted, leaving the family to defend their son's character against strangers who didn't know them. To the father, none of the theories fit. His sons weren't careless, they weren't reckless, and they weren't running from anything. That conviction only sharpened the mystery. If he was right, then something darker had taken place, something that none of the theories yet explained. As the case entered its third month, investigators were left with more questions than answers. Did the brothers vanish because of a mistake in the wilderness, swallowed by terrain that refused to give them back? Or had they encountered someone who meant them harm, a confrontation that ended with their disappearance? Each theory seemed to deepen the mystery instead of solving it, leaving the trail to grow cold under the weight of uncertainty. And with every passing day, the silence of the ridge pressed heavier on the community, leaving a haunting question in its wake. If none of the theories could explain what had happened, then what really had happened? When months of searching produced no answers, detectives shifted their focus from the forest to the brothers themselves. If the mountains refused to give up their secret, perhaps their personal lives would. Investigators began pulling apart their routines, questioning friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have known more than they initially shared. What emerged was a tangled picture. Two young men who appeared outwardly ordinary, yet carried shadows of tension that no one had fully understood at the time. One neighbor told detectives that the brothers had been seen arguing late at night in their driveway only weeks before the disappearance. Voices carried in the stillness of the neighborhood, sharp and angry, though the words could not be made out. To some it was nothing unusual. Siblings fight, then make up. But to investigators, it hinted at an underlying conflict. When pressed, friends admitted that the brothers had been secretive about something, a matter they never explained but often quarreled about when they thought no one was listening. Rumors began to swirl around a group of older men who frequented the ridge trails. Some were hunters, others locals who treated the woods as their own territory. A witness recalled seeing the brothers exchange tense words with two of these men a month before they vanished. The argument ended without violence, but it left an impression. Detectives tracked down the men and questioned them, but both denied any serious conflict. They admitted to knowing the brothers, claiming they had simply crossed paths on the trail, nothing more. Still, the story lingered. Why had witnesses remembered the tension so clearly? And what was it about those men that caused unease even years later? Investigators also uncovered financial activity that raised more questions than answers. Days before the disappearance, one of the brothers had withdrawn a substantial sum of money from his bank account, more than what would be needed for a simple hike, yet not enough to suggest he was planning a permanent escape. The withdrawal was unusual. Friends and family insisted he was careful with money, not prone to impulsive spending. Yet no one could say where that cash had gone. The detail sparked speculation that the brothers were meeting someone that day on the ridge, someone connected to the missing money. The combination of secrecy, tension, and unexplained financial activity left detectives torn between two possibilities. Either the brothers had been hiding something from their family, or they had become entangled in someone else's secret. Both scenarios pointed to a darker undercurrent, one that pushed the case further from the narrative of two hikers lost in the woods. The family, desperate for answers, bristled at the insinuations. They maintained the brothers were close, hard-working, and not involved in anything dangerous. To them, the idea that their sons had invited trouble felt like an attack on their memory. But detectives had little else to chase. Theories about mine shafts and sinkholes had led nowhere. Without physical evidence, their only path forward was to dig into the past and follow every rumor, no matter how fragile. The case file thickened with statements that hinted, but never proved. A co-worker recalled one brother mentioning he didn't trust certain people on the trail, though he never said who. A woman who lived near the trailhead remembered seeing a dark-colored truck idling near the lot the morning of the hike, but she couldn't identify the driver. Each detail suggested possible danger, but each also dissolved when investigators tried to pin it down. Witnesses contradicted one another, memories blurred, and the years that followed eroded any chance of clarity. Detectives found themselves trapped in the same cycle, chasing whispers, finding nothing solid, and returning to a case that refused to move forward. For the community, the new direction of the investigation sparked more fear. If the brothers had encountered trouble with people rather than nature, then the woods were no longer the only place to be wary of. The idea of human danger, of someone possibly lurking behind their disappearance, made the story spread further, feeding the legend that was beginning to grow around the ridge. And yet, with all the suspicion, nothing tangible could be tied to foul play. No truck was ever identified, no cash ever traced, no proof ever emerged of the older men's involvement. The detectives were left with a file filled with smoke, but no fire. What they had were fragments, arguments overheard, unexplained withdrawals, sightings of strangers, but none of it explained why two brothers had walked into the woods and never walked out. The family's grief deepened under the weight of rumor. To lose loved ones without explanation was one tragedy. To hear their lives dissected into suspicions was another. They clung to the belief that their sons were victims, not architects of their own fate. But behind closed doors, investigators couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of the past held pieces of the truth. The only question was whether those shadows belonged to the brothers themselves or to someone who had been waiting for them on that trail. The silence of the case pressed heavier with each passing year. Rumors remained, always resurfacing whenever a new fragment of information emerged. The tension between accident and foul play, between secret lives and unlucky encounters, only grew sharper. And with no resolution in sight, the mystery of what had happened seemed destined to hang over the family and community alike. What no one realized then was that answers would eventually surface, but not for another 16 years, and when they did, they would confirm that the shadows of the past were far darker than anyone had dared to believe. As the months bled into years, the once frantic search for the missing brothers slowed to a quiet crawl, and then to silence. The helicopters stopped circling the skies, the search dogs were recalled, and the volunteers who had once filled the woods with shouts and radio chatter drifted back to their normal lives. All that remained was the trail, stretching into the ridge as it always had, unchanged and indifferent, except for the reputation it now carried. What had once been a popular destination for families became a place of unease. Parents stopped bringing their children, hikers moved in groups instead of alone, and a cloud of suspicion seemed to hang over the forest. The disappearance of the brothers had scarred the community in ways that time could not fully heal. Over the years, the trail itself became a kind of shrine. Curious hikers and grieving strangers left flowers, crosses, and notes at the last place the brothers' footprints had been tracked. Some brought photographs of the missing men, taped to trees with weather-worn edges. Others tied ribbons to branches as a sign of remembrance. The site grew into a landmark of grief, a reminder of two young lives swallowed by the woods without a trace. It gave comfort to some, but for others, it kept the wound open. The investigation did not die so much as it faded into routine. Detectives who had once worked the case with urgency eventually retired or transferred. The file was passed on, thick with reports, maps, and handwritten notes, its cover marked by the fingerprints of too many hands. Every new detective who inherited it faced the same haunting reality. No matter how many pages filled the file, the core of the mystery had never moved forward. They read the same conflicting witness accounts, revisited the same speculative theories, and always ended in the same place, an empty trailhead and a silence that could not be explained. Every few years, the case would spark back to life with the discovery of a possible clue. A hunter would stumble. Across a bone in the underbrush, a hiker would find a decayed jacket tangled in brambles, or searchers would uncover rusted objects that seemed out of place in the wilderness. Each time, the news would ripple through the town, raising the fragile hope that at last the brothers had been found. But hope always collapsed under the weight of science. Forensic teams sent the fragments to labs, and each test returned the same result, not a match. The bones belonged to animals, the clothing to unrelated hikers, the objects to forgotten campers. Every false lead left the family reeling, forced to relive the trauma of waiting for news that never came. The years did not erase the case from public memory. Instead, it grew into something larger than itself. The brothers' disappearance became a local legend, a story retold in hushed voices around campfires and in classrooms when warnings about hiking safety were given. The trail earned nicknames, whispered with unease: the Ridge of No Return, the Haunted Path. Outsiders came to hike it not for the views, but for the morbid curiosity of walking in the footsteps of the vanished. Some claimed to feel an oppressive silence where the footprints had ended. Others insisted they heard echoes of voices on the wind. Rational or not, the mystery fed imaginations, and the woods became as famous for what was missing as for what was there. For the family, the passing years were far less romantic. Grief did not soften with time. It hardened, settling into a dull ache that lived beneath every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair. The father, who had once led search teams and begged officials to continue, grew older, but his obsession never loosened. He clipped articles about the case, marked maps with red ink, and called investigators each time a new discovery made the news. His voice carried both weariness and defiance, unwilling to let the silence win. For him, the idea that his son's story had become legend was no comfort. It was a cruel reminder that strangers had claimed the mystery while he was left with the loss. The case file gathered dust, but it never closed. Detectives kept it open on paper, a cold case without resolution, ready to be revisited if evidence ever surfaced. Yet, as the first decade passed, few believed an answer would come. The forest had been combed dozens of times, and each lead had ended in disappointment. Without bodies, without belongings, without witnesses who could speak with certainty, the case had all but slipped into myth. Still, the legend kept breathing. College students wrote papers on it, online forums debated it, and hikers uploaded grainy photographs of the memorials to social media, each post reviving the story for new audiences. The ridge became a place where the living crossed paths with absence, where the ordinary act of walking into the woods carried the weight of the unknown. But legends do not rest easily. Each retelling carried the same unanswered question, the one that haunted investigators and family alike. How do two young men vanish so completely that not even time can bring them back? That question lingered like a shadow across the community, deepening the sense that something about the case had never been fully uncovered. And then, 16 years after the brothers vanished, the silence that had defined the case was finally broken. A discovery, unexpected and undeniable, would surface in the woods and breathe life back into the investigation. A discovery that would drag the mystery out of legend and back into reality, revealing that the truth had been waiting, hidden, all along. 16 years had passed since the brothers disappeared, long enough for the case to become more folklore than investigation. Most people had resigned themselves to the belief that the truth would never be known. Detectives had retired, witnesses had faded into memory, and the forest had reclaimed its silence. But in the summer of the 16th year, when few were still looking for answers, the ridge trail yielded something that would drag the mystery back into the light. It happened during routine maintenance of an overgrown service path, a trail that had once been used by forestry crews but had long since fallen into disuse. Workers clearing brush and deadfall noticed a structure half hidden by trees and vines. At first, it looked like nothing more than a heap of rotting lumber, but as they cut the overgrowth back, its shape took form. It was an old hunting blind, elevated just off the ground, rusted nails and weather-worn boards holding together something that hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity drew them closer. When one of the workers stepped inside, the smell of damp rot and decay filled the air. Scattered across the floor were scraps of fabric, brittle and discolored by years of exposure. In one corner, partially buried in leaves, lay a broken watch with its face cracked and hands frozen in place. At first, it seemed like the remnants of long abandoned hunting gear, forgotten by whoever had once used the blind. But then, beneath a section of loose floorboards, one worker noticed something wedged in the gap. Pulling the boards aside, he uncovered a backpack. The bag was weathered and stiff, its fabric eaten away in patches, but still intact enough to unzip. Inside, the workers found items that made their stomachs drop. A driver's license, water-stained but legible, sat in a plastic sleeve. The name on it matched one of the missing brothers. For 16 years, people had searched for something, anything that might explain where the brothers had gone. And now, in an abandoned blind off a forgotten trail, their belongings had been found. Law enforcement was contacted immediately. Deputies arrived, secured the site, and collected the items as evidence. The backpack contained more than just the license. There were other belongings too degraded to identify clearly, scraps of paper too, damaged to read, and fragments of fabric that could have once been part of clothing. But it was the license that mattered most. It was undeniable proof that one of the brothers had been there. After years of speculation and dead ends, the case had a fresh lead. The news hit the community like a lightning strike. For over a decade and a half, the disappearance had been a wound that refused to close. Families had aged, children had grown up, and many of those who remembered the day the brothers vanished were now old themselves. To hear that their belongings had been found reopened all of it. The story dominated local headlines again, just as it had years before, only this time with the weight of a breakthrough. The families, long resigned to silence, found themselves dragged back into the spotlight. Their grief, dulled but never healed, was made raw once more. Detectives re-examined the discovery with urgency. The location itself was significant. The blind was far from the main ridge trail, accessible only by winding service roads and paths that most hikers never saw. It was not the kind of place the brothers would have stumbled across accidentally on a casual hike. To investigators, the site suggested something more intentional. Either they had been led there, or someone had brought their belongings to hide them. Forensic teams combed the blind for evidence. They photographed, measured, and collected every fragment. The broken watch was bagged and tagged, its frozen hands noted in reports. The scraps of fabric were sent to labs to determine whether they matched the brothers' clothing. The backpack itself was studied for prints, though time and weather had likely erased anything useful. Still, the very fact that the belongings had been preserved under the floorboards suggested someone had tried to conceal them. The discovery reframed the case entirely. For 16 years, theories had revolved around accident, misadventure, or chance encounter. But now, with the evidence found hidden beneath boards in a man-made structure, investigators began to lean heavily toward foul play. Someone had known the brothers were there. Someone had left their belongings behind in a place few people would ever look. Speculation erupted once again in the community. Who had built the blind, and when? Was it still in use at the time of the disappearance? Hunters familiar with the area admitted they had seen blinds like it before, built by locals to keep watch over game, but few could recall exactly who had claimed that spot. Memories blurred, stories conflicted, and after 16 years, names and faces had shifted with time. Yet the sense was undeniable. This was not an accident. For the family, the discovery was both a relief and a fresh wound. After so many years of silence, to hold a physical object once belonging to their sons felt like proof that their story had not been erased. But the circumstances raised darker questions. If the belongings were hidden, who had put them there? And what had happened to the brothers afterward? The answers were still missing, and in their place was the heavy implication of violence. Investigators reopened the case fully, determined to trace the new lead wherever it went. The blind became the focal point of renewed efforts, a symbol of the truth waiting to be uncovered. And as the community once again turned its eyes to the ridge, the haunting silence that had hung over it for 16 years began to shift. Something had been found, and something darker was beginning to take shape. What had once been legend was now evidence, and the question was no longer whether the brothers had vanished by chance. It was who had made them disappear, and why. The discovery of the backpack was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of a new investigation. Forensic teams treated it like the centerpiece of a puzzle that had been missing for 16 years. Every zipper, seam, and scrap of material was analyzed under sterile lights in the crime lab. They expected little given the years of exposure, but the bag yielded more than anyone had hoped. Tucked into a pocket, protected just enough by layers of fabric, was a torn sheet of paper. It was warped and water-damaged, the ink blurred in places, but parts of the writing remained visible. The words were jagged, rushed, and incomplete. Fragments of sentences bled together, but one phrase stood out with chilling clarity. "We shouldn't have agreed to meet him here." The page stopped there, the rest obscured by stains and torn edges. It wasn't a full journal, just a single sheet, as if ripped out and shoved quickly into the pack. But that fragment was enough to shift the narrative of the case. The brothers hadn't been alone on the ridge. They had been meeting someone, and something about that meeting had gone wrong. Detectives, stunned by the new evidence, cross-referenced the location of the hunting blind with old maps. What they found only deepened the suspicion. Less than a mile from the blind was the outline of a forgotten logging road, long overgrown and absent from modern trail maps. In its prime, it had served trucks hauling timber out of the forest, but now it existed as little more than a scar in the underbrush, hidden from casual hikers. Its proximity to the blind was no coincidence. Whoever had built the structure likely used the road for access, coming and going unseen by those on the ridge's main trail. The fact that the brothers' belongings had ended up there suggested they had crossed paths with someone who knew the hidden routes of the forest. Investigators dug into old reports from the late 90s and early 2000s, a period when illegal hunting was known to have flourished in that area. Wildlife officers had long suspected certain locals of poaching deer and bears out of season, using hidden blinds and unmarked roads to haul out their kills. Many of those cases had ended without arrests, the suspects elusive and protective of their territory. Tensions between hikers and hunters had been reported more than once, usually verbal confrontations about land use and trespassing. At the time, those incidents had been considered minor, but with the discovery of the backpack, they took on a darker significance. Detectives began interviewing those who had lived near the ridge back then, men now in their 50s and 60s. Many remembered talks of disputes over land access, especially between younger hikers who treated the ridge as public space and older men who guarded their hunting grounds as if they owned them. Witnesses recalled that the brothers had clashed more than once with hunters who believed the ridge trail cut too close to their unofficial territory. At the time, the disputes had been brushed aside as nothing more than heated arguments, but in the new light of the evidence, they felt like precursors to something much worse. The journal fragment weighed heavily in every conversation. It wasn't proof on its own. It could not be dated precisely, and it could not name who the brothers had met. But the tone of the words, the fear implied in them, was unmistakable. Investigators returned to the possibility that the brothers had been lured off the main trail for a meeting they expected to be tense but manageable, only for it to escalate into something neither of them had anticipated. The family struggled to process the revelations. 16 years of imagining accidents, falls, and even animal attacks were suddenly replaced with the suspicion that someone had orchestrated their son's disappearance. The idea that the brothers might have been trapped in a human conflict, one rooted in secrecy and control of the woods, broke open old wounds. For them, the note was a confirmation of what they had long feared. This had not been an accident. Detectives pieced together what they could from the blind, the backpack, and the geography of the area. The blind wasn't a random hiding spot. It was strategically placed with a clear line of sight to game trails and cover from the forgotten logging road. The fact that the backpack was hidden beneath its floorboards spoke to deliberate concealment. Whoever left it there had intended it not to be found, perhaps never expecting the blind itself to decay and give up its secret. The evidence pointed in one direction: foul play. Theories of lost hikers and accidents in the wilderness gave way to the likelihood of confrontation, perhaps even murder. Investigators were faced with a new reality. The trail the brothers had taken 16 years earlier had not led them into nature's trap, but into the hands of someone who had been waiting. The reawakened case drew the attention of the community once more. Old names resurfaced, locals who had once been whispered about but never charged. Detectives began to focus on men with histories of illegal hunting, men known for temper and territoriality. The hunt for answers was no longer about searching the ground, but about uncovering the secrets people had buried just as carefully as that backpack. The blind, the torn page, the forgotten logging road, all of it formed the outline of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The brothers had not walked into the woods and vanished without reason. They had been pulled into something darker, something rooted in control, secrecy, and violence. And now, after 16 years of silence, the trail was pointing investigators toward the people who had been there all along. The reawakened investigation soon began circling an old name, a man now in his 60s who had appeared briefly in the earliest reports but had never been charged. Back then, he had lived near the ridge, spending much of his time in the woods. He had a reputation as a poacher, someone who ignored hunting laws and treated the forest as his own. Over the years, he had built a history of confrontations with hikers who wandered too close to his territory. At the time, detectives questioned him and let him go, finding nothing concrete to hold against him. But with the discovery of the blind, the backpack, and the torn note, his name returned to the surface like a ghost. Detectives knocked on his door, and when they presented the new evidence, his hardened exterior began to crack. The license, the watch, the blind, they weren't just relics of the forest. They were remnants of a confrontation he had spent 16 years trying to bury. At first, he insisted he had nothing to do with their disappearance, just as he had all those years ago. But under the weight of the evidence, his voice faltered and the silence stretched too long. Eventually, he admitted the truth. He told investigators that on the day the brothers vanished, he had caught them near his hidden blind. They weren't hunting, but they had stumbled across what he considered his territory. Words were exchanged, sharp and heated. He claimed the brothers had mocked him, challenged him when he tried to chase them away. The argument spiraled, tempers flared, and in the struggle that followed, one of the brothers was struck, fatally. Panic consumed him. The second brother tried to run, but he caught him before he made it back to the trail. Faced with what he had done, he chose concealment over confession. He hid their belongings under the blind and left their bodies in a ravine miles from the search grid, confident the forest would keep its silence. His words were flat, spoken without embellishment, but they cut through 16 years of rumor and speculation. The mystery that had haunted the community was no longer faceless. It had a name, a story, and a man who could no longer deny what he had done. When the confession finally broke, detectives pressed for the one answer that still mattered most. Where were the brothers? The man, worn down by years of silence and the weight of his own guilt, agreed to take them there. Deputies followed as he led them deep into the forest, far beyond the grids that had once been combed by volunteers and search dogs. The trail wound through dense thickets and rocky outcrops until they reached a shallow ravine, hidden from view and miles from where the initial search had focused. He pointed toward the ground, his voice flat. This was where he had left them. Forensic teams descended into the ravine, carefully combing through layers of soil and debris. It did not take long. Bones lay scattered, partially concealed by years of erosion and leaf fall. Personal items, fragments of clothing, a rusted belt buckle, offered grim confirmation. Dental records sealed what the family already knew in their hearts. After 16 years of questions, the brothers had finally been found. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. They had not been lost to the wilderness or swallowed by hidden shafts. They had not walked away from their lives or staged their disappearance. They had stumbled into another man's secret, a poaching operation he guarded with rage and paranoia. Threatened, they tried to run. But the woods they had loved since childhood became their grave. News of the discovery spread quickly, reopening wounds across the community. For many, the case had become legend, a story without end. Now, the legend had a conclusion, ugly, tragic, and deeply human. For the family, the recovery was both relief and heartbreak. The brothers would finally come home, but only in the form of remains carried in small caskets. The father, now frail with age, stood at their graveside as they were lowered into the earth. 16 years of torment, of searching, of not knowing, ended in a moment of crushing finality. He had lived long enough to bury his sons, but the answers brought no peace, only the silence of truth. The mystery was over, but its shadow would remain forever.